All right, so if you ever like really wondered what makes people do truly awful things, what makes someone cross that line from everyday frustrations to like cold-blooded murder? I mean, it's a question that's haunted humanity forever, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, today we're going to dive deep into the science behind what we call evil. I remember this one time back in college. There was this guy, Mark, and he was constantly getting into trouble. He'd cheat on tests, steal people's stuff, just generally lie about everything. Everyone thought he was like a bad seed. But then get this, one day he confessed that he'd had a really rough childhood. Turns out his dad had abandoned the family when he was a kid, and his mom was struggling to make ends meet. Suddenly, it didn't excuse his behavior, but it did make you see him in a whole new light.
Yeah.
Made you wonder if maybe he was acting out because he was hurt and desperate, not because he was inherently evil. So, where do we even begin to define evil?
Mm.
Is it something we're born with, some kind of inborn darkness? Well, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche had some pretty interesting thoughts on this. He believed that evil isn't some objective reality, but rather a label we slap onto things we find unpleasant or threatening. So basically, it's all about perspective. What one person might consider evil, another might see as justified or even necessary. Pretty mind blowing when you think about it, right? This whole idea reminds me of this concept called evil empathy, which is all about trying to understand the motivations behind evil acts without, like, condoning them. It's not about excusing terrible behavior, but rather about trying to grasp the psychological and social forces that might have contributed to it. Because honestly, if we want to prevent evil from happening, we need to understand where it comes from, right? Okay, so let's say we ditch this idea that people are born evil. Then what's going on in our brains when we commit acts of cruelty or violence? I was reading this article about the neuroscience of evil, and it turns out there's no specific evil center in our brains, like some kind of dark passenger pulling the strings. Our brains are way more complex than that. Instead of looking for a single evil spot, researchers are focusing on the interplay of various brain regions and processes. For example, they're finding that areas associated with empathy and impulse control might be less active in people who commit violent acts. It's almost like their brains aren't sending those stop signals as strongly as they should. And then there's this whole other layer of complexity when you factor in things like de-individuation and dehumanization. De-individuation is when you lose your sense of individuality in a group setting, kind of like when you're in a huge crowd at a concert and feel like you can get away with stuff you wouldn't normally do.
Mhm.
It's like the anonymity gives you this false sense of freedom from consequences. And dehumanization, that's when you stop seeing others as fully human with their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. It's a really dangerous mental shortcut that can make it easier to justify harming them. Think about it. It's much harder to be cruel to someone when you see them as an individual with a family, hopes, dreams, and fears you know. But when you reduce them to a faceless other, it becomes easier to dismiss their suffering. And this is happening all around us, especially online. It's like the internet has become this breeding ground for dehumanization where people can hide behind anonymous profiles and spew hate with no accountability. It's a scary thought, isn't it? Okay, now this next one might sound kind of messed up, but bear with me. Have you ever heard of everyday sadists? Doom. These are people who, well, they actually derive pleasure from inflicting pain on others. It sounds totally disturbing, right? But researchers are finding that everyday sadism is more common than we might think. There was this one study where they had participants choose between killing bugs or completing a different, less violent task. And get this, some people actually chose to kill the bugs and even reported enjoying the crunching sound. I mean, it's just bugs, right? But it makes you wonder about the darker impulses that might be lurking within all of us. It's like, where do we draw the line between harmless curiosity and actual cruelty?
Mm.
All right, let's tackle a big one: aggression and testosterone. We all know that men commit more violent crimes than women, statistically speaking. So is it just a matter of biology? Are men inherently more aggressive because of those raging hormones? Well, there's definitely evidence to suggest that testosterone plays a role in aggression. Like, there was this study that looked at the testosterone levels of convicted murderers, and they found that the guys with higher testosterone tended to commit more brutal, planned out murders. Pretty chilling.
No, it's not that simple. The relationship between testosterone and aggression is way more nuanced than we might think. Like, there was this crazy experiment back in the 1800s where they messed with the testosterone levels of roosters. They basically castrated some of them and then gave others extra testosterone. And you know what? The ones with no testosterone could still be aggressive. It just took them a little longer to get riled up. So clearly, testosterone isn't the whole story. It might play a role, but there are definitely other factors at play, like social conditioning, environmental triggers, and individual differences in impulse control. So if it's not all about testosterone, then what is it about men that makes them more likely to be violent? Well, some researchers believe it might have to do with evolutionary pressures.
Like back in the day, men were the hunters and warriors, so they needed to be more physically aggressive to survive. And over time, those traits might have gotten well ingrained in their genes. But here's another thing to consider. Our culture often glorifies male aggression, right? Think about all the movies and TV shows where the tough, stoic hero solves problems with violence. And then we have things like toxic masculinity, where men are taught to suppress their emotions, express themselves through dominance and aggression. It's like we're setting them up to fail, you know? All right, here's a reality check for you. Most murders aren't committed by some evil mastermind plotting elaborate schemes. Nope, they often happen in totally everyday situations, fueled by things like arguments, jealousy, or perceived slights. It's kind of scary to think about, right? Like how easily a seemingly normal situation can escalate into violence. Researchers have actually come up with a typology of murders to try and understand the different motivations behind them. You have reactive murders, which are those impulsive acts of violence that happen in the heat of the moment, like a bar fight that turns deadly. Then there are instrumental murders, where the killing is done for a specific purpose, like getting rid of a rival or a witness. And finally, you have predatory murders, where the killer is actively seeking out victims, often driven by things like power and control. But here's the thing that really gets to me. It's kind of unsettling to realize that most of us have probably experienced similar emotions to murderers, right? We've all felt anger, jealousy, even rage. The difference is we don't act on those emotions in the same way. It makes you wonder about that fine line between a normal emotional response and something that could potentially spiral out of control. Okay, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about something a little less intense. Creepiness. You know, that feeling you get when someone or something just rubs you the wrong way, like a shiver down your spine. It's a universal experience, but have you ever wondered why we experience creepiness? Well, science has an answer for that too. Apparently, creepiness is an evolved threat detection mechanism. It's our brain's way of trying to warn us about potential danger, even if we can't consciously explain why something feels off. And research has shown that certain things are consistently perceived as creepy, like men staring too intensely, clowns and taxidermists. I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? There's something inherently unsettling about those things. But here's the interesting part. Our perceptions of creepiness are also influenced by social norms and cultural expectations. Like what might be considered creepy in one culture might be totally normal in another. It's like our brains are constantly trying to calibrate what's safe and what's not based on the context we're in. And this whole thing makes me think about a time when I was traveling alone in a foreign country. I was walking down this dark, deserted street late at night, and I saw this guy walking towards me. He wasn't doing anything particularly threatening, but I just had this overwhelming feeling of creepiness, you know? Like all my alarm bells were going off. I ended up crossing the street and practically running back to my hostel. Looking back, I don't know if I was overreacting or if my instincts were right. But it definitely made me realize how powerful those gut feelings can be, even if we can't always articulate why we're feeling them. All right, let's tackle a really important topic: mental illness and violence. How many times have you heard someone say, oh, they must be mentally ill after a horrific crime? It's become this knee-jerk reaction, and it's perpetuating a really dangerous stereotype. But here's the truth, backed by research. Mental illness alone is a really poor predictor of whether someone is going to be violent. In fact, people with mental illnesses are actually more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators. And think about it, the stigma surrounding mental illness can actually prevent people from seeking help, which can then exacerbate existing problems and potentially lead to more issues down the line. It's like this vicious cycle, right? We stigmatize mental illness, people are afraid to get help, and then if something bad happens, we point to mental illness as the cause. It's a classic case of blaming the victim instead of addressing the real systemic issues that contribute to violence and crime. Now, remember that Stanford prison experiment I mentioned earlier, the one where they put college students in a mock prison and things got really, really messed up? Well, that experiment is a perfect example of how situational factors can have a powerful influence on behavior, even overriding our individual morals and personalities. They took these perfectly normal, healthy guys and randomly assigned them to be either prisoners or guards. And within days, the guards started abusing their power, humiliating the prisoners, and coming up with these messed up psychological torture tactics. And the prisoners, they became withdrawn, submissive, and some even experienced emotional breakdowns. It was so bad that they had to shut the whole experiment down after just 6 days. So what does this experiment tell us? It shows that even ordinary people placed in the right or wrong situation can exhibit surprisingly cruel behavior. It's like the environment itself can create a kind of toxic feedback loop where even small acts of aggression can escalate into something truly horrifying. It's kind of scary to think about, right? Like how much of our behavior is determined by our surroundings and how easily we could be swayed by group dynamics and authority figures. It's a sobering reminder that evil isn't always some far-off abstract concept. It's something that can happen anywhere, anytime, if the conditions are right. All right, I think that's enough for now. We've covered a lot of ground, from defining evil to exploring the complex interplay of biology, psychology, and social factors that can contribute to it. But before we wrap up part one, I want to leave you with this thought. If evil is something that can be learned, something that can be influenced by our environment and the people around us, then surely it can also be unlearned. Maybe, just maybe, understanding the science of evil can help us find ways to create a world where kindness, compassion, and empathy prevail. Stay tuned for part two, where we'll delve deeper into the psychology of evil and explore some of the things we can do to combat it. All right, so we've talked about how our brains work, how everyday situations can turn deadly, and even how seemingly harmless things can creep us out. But what about those times when we see something bad happening and we just freeze? Like we're witnessing something awful, but we just can't bring ourselves to intervene. That's the bystander effect in action. And it's one of the most frustrating and, frankly, terrifying aspects of human behavior. It's like our brains just short circuit when we're in a crowd and we convince ourselves that someone else will take care of it. The most famous example, of course, is the murder of Kitty Genovese, stabbed to death outside her apartment building while 38 people supposedly saw or heard something and did nothing. It's heartbreaking, and it makes you wonder, what would I have done? Would I have been the one to call for help, or would I have just frozen like everyone else? There's the whole psychology behind it, right? Like there's diffusion of responsibility, where everyone assumes someone else will step up. Then there's evaluation apprehension. We're afraid of looking foolish or making things worse. And then there's pluralistic ignorance if no one else seems concerned. We assume everything must be okay. It's a recipe for inaction, and it can have devastating consequences. This whole thing makes me think about this time I was at a party, and this guy was getting way too handsy with a girl who was clearly uncomfortable. Everyone was kind of watching, but no one was doing anything. And I'll admit, I hesitated for a moment. I was like, maybe someone else will say something. But then I realized, no, this is wrong. I have to do something. So I went over there and I told the guy to back off. And you know what? He did. It wasn't easy, but it made me realize that sometimes you just have to be the one to break the cycle of silence. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if you're scared, speaking up can make a huge difference. Speaking of situations that can bring out the worst in us, let's talk about the infamous Stanford prison experiment. It's one of those studies that just stays with you, They took these college students, totally normal guys, and randomly assigned them to be prisoners or guards in a mock prison. And things went downhill fast. The guards started abusing their power, humiliating the prisoners, and coming up with these messed up psychological torture tactics. And the prisoners, they became withdrawn, submissive, and some even had emotional breakdowns. They had to shut the whole thing down after just 6 days because it got so out of control. So what does this experiment tell us? It shows that even ordinary people placed in the right or wrong situation can exhibit surprisingly cruel behavior. The environment, the power dynamics, the anonymity, it all created this toxic feedback loop that turned these regular guys into, well, something else entirely. It's a chilling reminder that we're all capable of darkness given the right circumstances. And remember Philip Zimbardo, the guy who ran the experiment? Well, he spent his whole career trying to understand how this happens, how ordinary people can do terrible things. He calls it the Lucifer effect, this idea that certain situations can create a perfect storm for evil to flourish. He identifies 7 social processes that contribute to this effect. Things like dehumanization, obedience to authority group, conformity, and moral disengagement. It's like a recipe for turning good people into monsters, and it's happening all around us all the time. Think about it. We've all experienced these things to some degree, right? We've all been in situations where we felt pressured to conform or where we looked away from something wrong because we didn't want to rock the boat. It's a sobering reminder that evil isn't always some far-off abstract concept. It's something that can happen anywhere, anytime, if the conditions are right. Now, shifting gears again, let's talk about something that's been in the news a lot lately, rape culture. It's a heavy topic, but we can't afford to ignore it. So what exactly is ISO rape culture? Well, it's not just about the act of rape itself. It's about the broader societal norms and attitudes that create an environment where sexual violence is tolerated, excused, and even encouraged. It's like this insidious web of beliefs that permeates our culture, making it difficult to recognize and address the problem. And one of the most dangerous aspects of rape culture is that it often blames the victims instead of holding the perpetrators accountable. Like, think about all the times you've heard questions like, what was she wearing? Or why was she drinking so much? It's like we're automatically assuming that women are somehow responsible for the violence inflicted upon them, instead of focusing on the actions of the men who chose to commit those acts. And it's not just about these overt forms of victim blaming. It's also about the more subtle ways we normalize and trivialize sexual harassment and assault. Like, think about all the sexist jokes, the catcalling, the unwanted touching that women experience on a daily basis. These behaviors are often dismissed as harmless or just boys being boys, but the truth is they contribute to a culture where men feel entitled to women's bodies and where women are constantly living in fear. And here's something that's really important to remember. Rape culture doesn't just harm women, it harms everyone. It creates a climate of fear and distrust. It perpetuates harmful gender stereotypes, and it prevents us from having healthy, respectful relationships. It's a societal problem that requires a societal solution, and we all have a role to play in dismantling it. And the whole thing makes me think about a time when I was in high school. There was this guy on the football team who was kind of a star athlete, you know? And he had this reputation for being a real player. Like, he would brag about hooking up with different girls all the time. And one day I heard him talking about this girl he'd been with at a party. And he was using really degrading language. Like, he was boasting about how he'd taken advantage of her. Mm. And I remember feeling so disgusted, but I didn't say anything. I was just a freshman and he was a senior. And I didn't want to cause any trouble. But looking back, I wish I had said something. I wish I had stood up for that girl, even if it meant going against the popular crowd. Silence is complicity, right? And we all have a responsibility to speak out against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. So we've talked about some pretty heavy stuff today, the bystander effect, the Lucifer effect, rape culture. It can all feel pretty overwhelming, right? Like, how do we even begin to fight against all this darkness?
Well, one thing that keeps coming up in all this research is the power of awareness. Once we understand the psychological and social forces that contribute to evil, we can start to recognize those patterns in ourselves and in the world around us. Like, if you know you're prone to road rage, you can take steps to manage your anger while driving right.
Or if you're aware of your own implicit biases, you can consciously try to counteract them. It's not about being perfect. It's about being mindful and intentional in our actions. And honestly, that's where hope lies, in recognizing our own capacity for both good and evil and choosing to actively cultivate the good. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll explore some specific ways that we can combat evil in our everyday lives. Because even in the face of darkness, there's always light. We just have to choose to see it, to nurture it, to let it guide us towards a better future. Okay, so we've talked about all the ways that humans can be well, terrible, the science of evil, the bystander effect, those deep-seated biases that lead to all sorts of messed up behavior. But here's the question that keeps nagging at me. If we're wired for all this darkness, can we actually change things? Can we rewire ourselves for good? I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the negativity in the world, right? Like just turn on the news and it's a constant barrage of violence, corruption, just general awfulness. It's enough to make you want to crawl under a rock and hide. But here's the thing. Giving up isn't an option. We have to believe that change is possible, even if it's slow and incremental. So where do we even start? How do we fight against something as deeply ingrained as, human nature? Well, one thing that keeps coming up in all this research is the power of awareness. Once we understand the psychological and social forces that contribute to evil, we can start to recognize those patterns in ourselves and in the world around us. It's like if you know you're prone to road rage, you can take steps to manage your anger while driving right. Or if you're aware of your own implicit biases, you can consciously try to counteract them. It's not about being perfect. It's about being mindful and intentional in our actions. And here's another key ingredient, empathy. I know it's a cliche, but it's true. When we can put ourselves in someone else's shoes, when we can see the world from their perspective, it becomes much harder to dehumanize them or justify harming them. I remember this one time I was at the grocery store and this older woman was struggling to reach a can of soup on the top shelf. And I was in a hurry, trying to get in and out as quickly as possible. But then I saw her face and she looked so frustrated and helpless. And it just hit me. What if that were my grandmother? Would I want someone to help her? So I stopped and grabbed the can for her. And she was so grateful. She even gave me a hug. It was just a small act of kindness, but it made me realize that even the smallest gestures can make a big difference in someone's day. And it reminded me that we're all connected. We're all just trying to make our way through this crazy world. And a little bit of empathy can go a long way. And okay, here's something that might sound kind of radical, but I truly believe it's essential forgiveness. Now, before you get all defensive, I'm not saying we have to forgive everyone who's ever wronged us, especially if they haven't genuinely apologized or shown remorse. But I do think there's a difference between condoning harmful behavior and refusing to let it poison our hearts. I used to have this friend who totally betrayed my trust, spread rumors about me behind my back, tried to sabotage my relationships, a whole 9 yards. And for a long time, I was so angry and hurt, I wanted to get revenge, make her feel the pain she'd caused me. But then I realized holding on to all that anger was only hurting me. It was keeping me trapped in the past, preventing me from moving on. So I made a conscious decision to forgive her, not for her, but for myself. It wasn't easy, but it was incredibly liberating. It allowed me to let go of all that negativity and finally start healing. And here's the thing about forgiveness that's really interesting. It can actually help break the cycle of evil. When we choose to forgive us, we're essentially refusing to participate in that tit-for-tat retaliation that so often escalates conflicts. We're choosing to create a space for compassion and understanding, which can sometimes be the first step towards reconciliation and healing. Okay, so awareness, empathy, and forgiveness are all great. But what about the systems and structures that perpetuate evil? Like the institutions, the policies, the power dynamics that allow for discrimination, exploitation, and violence to flourish? Well, here's where activism comes in. We can't just focus on changing ourselves. We have to work to change the world around us too. It's about speaking out against injustice, advocating for marginalized communities, and demanding that our leaders create a more just and equitable society. I know it can feel daunting, right? One person can't possibly make a difference against all the systems of oppression. But here's the thing. It's not about doing it all alone. It's about joining forces with others, organizing and building a collective movement for change. It's like, remember that time when everyone was talking about that awful factory that was exploiting its workers? I was reading all these articles about it, seeing the protests on social media, and I felt so powerless. I was like, what can I possibly do? I'm just one person. But then I realized I could actually make a difference. I stopped buying products from that company. I donated to organizations that were supporting the workers, and I started talking to my friends and family about the issue. And you know what? It felt good. It felt like I was actually doing something, even if it was just a small part. So what can we do in our everyday lives to fight against evil? Well, it could be as simple as calling out a racist joke, donating to a charity that supports a cause you believe in, or volunteering your time to help those in need. It could be about educating yourself on social justice issues, having difficult conversations with your family and friends, and using your platform, however small, to amplify marginalized voices. It's about choosing kindness over indifference, courage over fear, and love over hate. It's about refusing to be a bystander and instead being an active participant in creating a world where everyone can thrive. I know it sounds idealistic, maybe even naive, but I truly believe that if enough of us commit to doing the work to making those small but meaningful changes in our lives, we can tip the scales towards good. We can create a world where evil doesn't have the power to destroy us. So I'll leave you with this. What will you do differently now? What small act of kindness, of courage, of love will you commit to today? Because even in the face of darkness, there is always light. We just have to choose to see it, to nurture it, to let it guide us towards a better future. And that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for listening.